Sometimes the quietest places hide the loudest secrets, a retreat by the sea, a portrait with no name, and a silence that stretched across decades. But truth, like a late blooming flower, has a way of finding light. Where in the world are you tuning in from? What time is it for you right now? Let me know in the comments. Let's begin the story. Jessica Fletcher stepped off the modest shuttle with her hands wrapped around the worn leather strap of her travel bag. The breeze coming off the Taranport coast had a salt-sweet scent, touched by the delicate perfume of wild roses growing along the narrow lane that led to the Briar House Inn. It had been nearly a year since Margaret Duval passed. Jessica still remembered the last postcard Margaret had sent, a watercolour of sea-pale skies above a crumbling greenhouse. "The light still changes, even when no one's watching," she had written. Now Taranport felt unchanged, and yet distant, like a photograph long ago developed and slightly faded with time. The locals offered nods, a few brief smiles, but there was a careful quietness in the way people greeted her. It was as if the town itself was holding its breath. The inn stood like a secret too proud to confess itself. Ivy-trimmed, pale wood verandas and windows that blinked sunlight with the hesitancy of a memory. Jessica was welcomed by Catherine Duval, Margaret's niece, who wore her composure like an heirloom coat, formal, threadbare in places. "Thank you for coming, Mrs. Fletcher. It means a great deal," Catherine said, her lips curled in a polite smile that never reached her cool, pale eyes. Jessica returned the gesture. "Margaret was a dear friend. I wouldn't have been anywhere else." But as they walked toward the inner garden for the memorial gathering, Jessica couldn't shake a feeling, not grief, precisely, but something adjacent to it. A tension held just beneath the surface, like the stillness before a storm that no one had yet admitted was coming. The garden had been arranged meticulously, too meticulously. Every white chair was set at the same angle, the rose bushes trimmed into symmetry, and small linen-covered tables bore neat glass pitchers of elderflower tea. It all looked composed. Jessica's eyes drifted toward the centerpiece, Margaret's final painting, displayed on an easel beneath a climbing trellis of lilacs. The brushstrokes were unmistakably hers, fluid, aching with subtle emotion. But the subject was unsettling, a faceless woman in a lavender gown, smiling faintly, her features blurred as if washed away by time. "She never signed it," Catherine remarked quietly. "We found it like this the day after. Well, we've left it as it was." Jessica nodded, but her mind tugged elsewhere, toward the woman in the portrait. There was something unfinished not only in the painting, but in the way Catherine spoke of it, as if the image itself had been left behind mid-sentence. Guests mingled politely, exchanging pleasantries, but beneath their words Jessica detected a pause, a hesitation before mentioning Margaret's final months. Catherine smiled her delicate, curated smile at each guest in turn, yet her fingers tugged almost imperceptibly at the hem of her sleeve. When Reverend Green began the dedication, Jessica folded her hands. But even as the prayers were spoken, her gaze lingered on the painting. A smile without a face. A woman without a name. A story, perhaps, still waiting to be told. One Margaret had started in brushstrokes instead of words. Later that afternoon, Jessica requested a visit to Margaret's old studio. Catherine offered a brief hesitation, then led her through the garden path to a small carriage house, weathered but warm with filtered light. The studio felt untouched, or rather preserved. The easel still stood in the corner, a smear of indigo still damp on the palette. The shelves bore Margaret's notebooks arranged in near-perfect order. Yet Jessica's eyes, trained by years of both writing and solving mysteries, caught the difference. One shelf showed a faint dust line where two journals had once sat, now gone. Another held a carved wooden box, its lid slightly ajar, revealing a rusted music box inside. Jessica wound it gently. A slow, off-key lullaby unfurled into the air, brittle with age. She turned toward the tall windows. There, behind a loose pane of glass, someone had placed a delicate iris, dried, pressed between two glass plates and framed in copper. Its purple hue had faded, but its presence felt deeply personal. A symbol, perhaps even a goodbye. "Margaret worked late here most nights," Catherine said softly behind her. She said painting was the only way the noise stopped. Jessica said nothing. She was listening to more than just words. Catherine left shortly after, citing errands. Alone again, Jessica opened the remaining journals. Nothing out of the ordinary, musings on colour, form, light. But the last entry stopped abruptly, mid-sentence, as if Margaret had intended to return to it, as if she had been interrupted. Closing the journal, Jessica looked once more at the faceless woman in the painting, and for the first time wondered if Margaret had known her days were numbered, and had begun leaving breadcrumbs. That evening, Jessica shared a quiet supper with Reverend Alan Green, one of the few remaining souls in Taranport whom she trusted completely. They dined on roasted cod and garden potatoes beneath the soft glow of the inn's porch lanterns. Margaret had grown withdrawn, he said carefully. She cancelled parish events, declined visitors, except for that last summer. That's when Catherine returned. Jessica raised an eyebrow. Was there tension between them? Reverend Green hesitated, then sipped from his glass. Not openly. Catherine was always precise, very composed, but Margaret was troubled. She'd started a new series of paintings she wouldn't show anyone. I caught glimpses, all the same figure. A woman alone, always smiling. Jessica nodded slowly. The smile that hides something, or replaces something. He met her eyes. I think Margaret was trying to say something, but she'd stopped speaking it out loud. A soft wind stirred the leaves nearby, carrying the scent of time and earth. Jessica felt a familiar flutter, not dread, but that intuitive shift in the air that came when a truth hovered near, just beyond reach. She wasn't afraid, Reverend Green added, but she was burdened. And I think whatever she carried, she didn't want Catherine to bear it. Jessica folded her napkin with quiet care. Something unspoken had bloomed between the women in those final weeks. And whatever it was, it hadn't yet found its full voice. But its echo lingered in the painting, in the iris, and perhaps in silence itself. As twilight sank over Taranport, Jessica wandered the garden once more. The lamplight from the inn cast gentle halos on the stone paths, and the guests had long since retired to their rooms. All that remained were shadows, scent, and the quiet hush of a coastal evening. She paused before the painting again. The faceless woman, the crescent smile. It was not a smile of serenity. It was not even a smile of grief. It was something more elusive, a shape crafted to keep others at ease, while something behind it stayed hidden. Jessica's gaze moved to the framed iris in the window of the studio beyond. Margaret had chosen that flower for a reason. Fragile, seasonal, yet resilient. A symbol of memory, of mourning, or perhaps warning. A smile, Jessica thought, could mean 1,000 things, but when everyone in town wore one, careful, polite, restrained, the effect was less comforting and more unsettling. As if the truth had been buried just beneath the surface, and everyone had agreed not to disturb it. And yet someone, perhaps Margaret herself, had left the clues intact. Quiet ones, just waiting for the right eyes to notice. The house had gone still by evening, the low murmur of guests replaced by the faint ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. Jessica had returned to her room only briefly when a muffled voice called for help, a startled, trembling voice from downstairs. She followed it to the library. There, slumped in one of the carved mahogany armchairs, sat Everett Lane. His head tilted gently to the side, one arm resting on the book in his lap, as if he had simply fallen asleep. Except that he wasn't breathing. His mouth had fallen slightly open, frozen in an expression that could almost have been mistaken for peace, or perhaps something just shy of it. Jessica's eyes travelled upward. Above Everett, affixed to the wall, hung Margaret's final painting, the faceless woman in lavender. The smile still hovered on her blurred lips, half-formed and unsettling. In the dim light of the room, it seemed almost to glow. Catherine entered moments later, one hand clamped to her mouth. "Oh, God," she whispered. He was just here this afternoon. I saw him in the garden." Jessica knelt beside the body, instinct taking quiet precedence over shock. A cracked teacup lay on the floor beside the chair, pale dregs of liquid staining the rug beneath. She touched the man's wrist, felt for a pulse, already knowing she would find none. There was no note, no sign of violence. Yet something quiet and deliberate, was off. Jessica knew death when she saw it, but this one didn't feel accidental. It felt arranged. By morning, the coroner had given the expected answer: heart failure, perhaps induced by stress. He was in his 60s, someone remarked. A man with a temper like that doesn't live forever. But Jessica wasn't satisfied with that explanation. She'd known Everett Lane professionally, if not intimately. He had been sharp, opinionated, not easily rattled. For all his faults, he had a certain resilience, and an ego that did not tire easily. She returned to the library alone once the room had been cleared and silence reclaimed it. The faint scent of lavender polish still lingered, as did the delicate trace of chamomile. Her eyes scanned the details. The teacup had been collected by the staff, but the stain on the rug remained, almost too perfectly circular. Jessica traced her fingers along the small cabinet behind the armchair. Its lock, old and stubborn, now hung slightly ajar. That, she thought, was not usual. And then she noticed something missing. Everett, near-sighted to the point of near blindness, was never without his reading glasses, particularly when examining books, which the open volume in his lap suggested he had been doing. And yet the glasses were nowhere to be found. A sudden chill tickled her spine. People might overlook a missing object, but Jessica Fletcher didn't believe in tidy coincidences, not when the surroundings suggested someone had tried, with care, to make this death appear natural. Someone had been here with him. Someone who wanted it all to look like rest. Later that day, as the guests mourned quietly in their respective corners of the estate, Jessica wandered into the lower garden under the pretense of admiring the rosemary hedge. The wind had picked up slightly, carrying snatches of conversation with it. She paused behind the pergola, her fingers brushing against a cluster of thyme blossoms, when she heard Catherine's voice, low, taut. "He said he had documents," she whispered harshly. A younger voice responded, Leo Hart, the retreat's gardener. "I told you I didn't know he'd show up again. He said he just wanted to see her work, that's all." "That's not all, and you know it." There was a pause, footsteps on gravel. Then Leo's voice again, tinged with fear. "You think I would have—" "Catherine, you can't honestly believe it." "Don't talk so loud." Her voice lowered further. "I told you this would come back." Jessica stepped away gently, making no sound. She had no intention of confronting them just yet. But the thread had tugged loose. Everett's visit had stirred something unresolved, and Leo, she now suspected, had been more than just a gardener in Margaret's final weeks. There was a thread of guilt in his voice. Guilt, or perhaps panic. Jessica returned to the inn slowly, her mind working through the fragments. Two people afraid of a man now dead, a conversation spoken in the garden as if the walls might listen, and a portrait still watching from the library, its smile undisturbed. Jessica sat that evening in the sunroom with Reverend Green, who had graciously offered her a cup of blackcurrant tea and a sliver of ginger cake. The conversation remained light until Jessica gently changed the subject. Everett Lane had visited Taranport before, hadn't he? She asked casually. The Reverend nodded. Briefly, about a month before Margaret passed, said he was doing a retrospective on her earlier pieces, though Margaret didn't seem thrilled by the idea. Did anyone know he was coming? Not many. Catherine was out of town then, I believe. He only stayed a night. I remember because he asked to see the sanctuary records. Said he was researching the history of the sanatorium before it became the retreat. Jessica's brows lifted slightly. That didn't sound like Everett's typical interests. The art world, yes. Institutional history, number. And did he say why? Reverend Green gave a modest shrug. Something about Margaret's earlier influences, but truthfully I think he was after something personal. Jessica sipped her tea, her mind carefully arranging the puzzle. So Everett had come quietly, asked questions about the past, then returned weeks later, only to die beneath Margaret's final work. And no one had mentioned that first visit until now. She set her cup down. Silence could be self-preservation. But sometimes it was something closer to fear. That night, Jessica stood once more before Margaret's final painting. The garden was quiet, save for the whisper of wind through the hedge. The faceless woman in lavender remained unchanged, yet the canvas seemed to pulse with something unspoken. A final message, perhaps, waiting to be deciphered. Margaret had always hidden her truths in symbols. Jessica remembered an early piece she once saw, a still life of a half-eaten pear beside an overturned glass. At first glance it was charming, but once you learned Margaret had painted it days after her sister's disappearance, the image took on a different meaning. Now Jessica studied the painting again. The woman's smile curved slightly higher on one side, not quite serene, not quite sinister. The lavender gown bled into the background with too much intent. And there, in the lower right, a single stroke of green unlike the others, barely visible but deliberate. Iris green, Jessica thought. The same as the pressed flower in the studio window. The same as the plant Margaret had once said reminded her of things she couldn't forget but never dared say aloud. The portrait wasn't unfinished. It was coded. Everett must have noticed it too. Perhaps he'd said something to Catherine or to Leo. Jessica imagined him standing here, squinting at the painting, realizing its secrets, and perhaps paying the price for understanding what Margaret had left behind. Jessica's thoughts lingered on the stroke of green, the missing journals, the smile with no eyes. Whatever Margaret had known, she hadn't written it down. She had painted it. Jessica rose early the next morning, the faint scent of salt and lilac lingering in the air. She dressed thoughtfully, her mind still occupied with the green stroke in Margaret's painting and the missing journals. If there were answers to be found, they would lie not just in objects, but in the people who had surrounded Margaret in her final days. Her first conversation was with Diana Kells, a former stage actress whose air of practiced elegance only partially concealed the tremor in her fingers. Margaret was a kind soul, Diana said, absently stirring her tea. But in the end, she was distant, distracted. I think she was painting someone, or something she couldn't quite face. Jessica studied her. And did Everett disturb her peace? Diana hesitated. He disturbed everyone's peace. Next came Nina Morales, soft-spoken, with tired eyes and a paint-stained sweater. She was like a mother to me, Nina whispered. She believed in seeing what others ignore. She told me once that she painted truth through silence. Jessica tilted her head. And did she ever speak of her family? Nina nodded faintly. Only once. She said, sometimes love has to leave the house to keep breathing. I didn't understand it at the time. Jessica thanked her and moved on. Finally, Leo. His boots were still muddy from the garden, but his voice was brittle with defensiveness. I only tried to help her, he said. She was sick toward the end, tired, but she didn't want anyone fussing over her. Did Everett know something he shouldn't have? Leo's eyes flickered. He always knew more than he let on. Each interview left Jessica with more emotion than certainty. They weren't lying, not all of them, but none of them were telling the full truth either. And truth, she'd learned, often lived in the silences people thought they'd filled. The Briar House Inn had once been a sanatorium, but now its office bore the scent of lemon oil and aging paper. Catherine had reluctantly agreed to let Jessica examine Margaret's estate files, under supervision, of course. "I thought you were here for the memorial," Catherine said, voice calm but cool. "I am," Jessica replied gently. "But when a man dies under suspicious circumstances in the same house where a woman changed her will weeks before her own death, it's hard not to wonder." Catherine's fingers hovered briefly over the brass edge of the desk before she passed the folder across. Jessica read, slowly, carefully. The last page was the addendum, dated 3 months before Margaret's passing. The original heir, Catherine herself, had been replaced by an unnamed beneficiary. Only a single initial was listed, J. "That could be anyone," Catherine said before Jessica could ask. "A clerical error, perhaps." Jessica glanced up. Margaret was precise. If she used an initial, she meant it. Catherine folded her arms. "Are you accusing me of something, Mrs. Fletcher?" "Not at all, but I do think Margaret was trying to protect someone or leave something unfinished." Jessica returned the folder, but not the thought. A single letter in a will could be anything, or everything. Was it Jessica herself, Leo, someone from Margaret's past? The name wasn't lost. It had been hidden, intentionally. And whoever this J was, Everett Lane might have known or guessed, and died for being too close to the truth. That afternoon, Reverend Green met Jessica on the chapel steps, his face touched by concern that went deeper than grief. "I've been meaning to speak with you," he said quietly. "There's something you ought to know, though I admit I struggled with whether it was my place." Jessica folded her hands, encouraging him gently. "If it troubled you, then perhaps it troubled Margaret as well." He gave a small nod, drawing a worn envelope from his coat pocket. "This letter came from Everett Lane, a month before Margaret died. He sent it to Catherine, but I intercepted it accidentally. It was addressed care of the rectory." Jessica opened it carefully. The handwriting was aggressive, slanted, almost impatient. "Her latest work is not artistic expression, it's madness. You must intervene before she ruins herself and everything she once stood for." "He thought Margaret had lost touch with reality?" Jessica asked. He believed the new series, The Faceless Women, reflected not introspection, but delusion. Jessica read it again. Everett hadn't just been concerned. He had been insistent, even cruel. He didn't want Margaret protected. He wanted her controlled. "And Catherine?" she asked softly. "She never mentioned the letter," Reverend Green admitted. "But they argued. I overheard something, Catherine pleading with Margaret not to exhibit the paintings." Jessica exhaled slowly. The thread was tightening. Everett had threatened Margaret's legacy. Catherine had tried to contain it. And somewhere in between was the truth Margaret had chosen not to speak, but to paint. The silence, Jessica now understood, wasn't absence. It was defiance. Jessica sat in the study, the early light of morning catching the edge of a small object resting in her hand, a ceramic bell. It had been found in Everett Lane's coat pocket, delivered to her by the housekeeper with a bewildered shrug. "I thought you might know what it means," she'd said. "Mr. Lane never mentioned it to anyone." It was old, the glaze spiderwebbed with tiny fractures, the kind of item that might be mistaken for trinket or trash, unless you knew its history. Jessica turned it over gently. On the underside, barely visible, was a faint hand-painted emblem, a half-sun over a walled gate. Her memory stirred. Margaret had once told her about the bells used in the sanatorium when it had still been in operation, a quiet signal system for patients confined to their rooms. One woman rang hers every morning, Margaret had said, though no one ever came. They said she smiled at nothing. That smile became a story. Jessica closed her fingers around the bell. If Everett had carried it, he must have found it, or been given it, recently. And if Margaret had told that story once, perhaps she had told it again, or painted it, the painting, the woman with no face, only a smile. Jessica's thoughts aligned slowly, like a constellation just beginning to make sense. The cracked bell wasn't just a token. It was a key, not to the crime perhaps, but to the meaning behind it. There had been silenced voices in this house long before Everett's. And perhaps Margaret's final work wasn't just expression, it was testimony. Now Jessica wondered, whose silence had Margaret painted? The day wore on, but Jessica remained in quiet motion, reading, listening, walking the grounds as if in idle reflection. In truth, her mind was in relentless motion, circling one persistent idea. The silence surrounding Margaret's death felt too practiced to be merely the result of grief. It was defensive, protective, and learned. She found herself back in the hallway just outside Margaret's former bedroom, now closed, its door rarely opened since her passing. Jessica ran her fingers along the wallpaper, floral and soft in hue, but marked here and there by faint scuffs, as if furniture had once been hurriedly moved or replaced. Silence, Jessica thought, didn't always mean stillness. Sometimes it was just noise tucked neatly away. She paused at the end of the corridor, where a narrow alcove displayed some of Margaret's earlier work, landscapes mostly. But one stood out, a small canvas, sepia-toned, showing the old Briar House gates partially open beneath a storm-dark sky. There, tucked at the base of the gate, almost hidden in the underpainting, was a faint impression. A bell. The same bell. Her breath caught softly. Margaret had painted the same motif again and again, layered beneath landscapes and figures. A bell, a gate, and always the hint of something left unsaid, a pattern of silence. Jessica stepped back. Everett had come here, not merely to document Margaret's work, but perhaps to unearth something deeper. Something institutional, perhaps shameful. Catherine's discomfort, Leo's defensiveness, Nina's hesitation. Each response had pointed away from the painting and toward something older, something embedded in the walls of Briar House itself. What if Everett's mistake wasn't just what he knew, but what he touched? What if Margaret's silence had preserved a secret? And what if someone had killed to keep it buried? The afternoon light slanted across the wooden floorboards of Margaret's studio, catching on the rim of a porcelain mixing dish and the edge of an empty canvas. Jessica stood at the threshold, reflecting on the paintings Margaret had never completed, and on the ones she had hidden in plain sight. She turned as the door creaked slightly behind her. Leo stood there, his shoulders hunched, hands muddied from morning work. His expression was guarded, but his eyes held a reluctant admission. "I know why you're here," he said, his voice low. "You heard about me coming in here at night." Jessica studied him for a moment, then nodded once. "People say you were caught snooping." Leo exhaled, somewhere between resignation and anger. "I wasn't stealing anything. I was looking for something Margaret told me existed." He stepped into the room slowly, glancing around like the studio still breathed her memory. She said there were things in her past she couldn't speak of, but she'd been trying to paint them, to leave some trace. Jessica folded her arms. "And you believed Everett was looking for the same thing?" "I know he was," Leo said. "That's why he kept showing up, pretending to write about her art. He wanted what was buried, and I think he found something. Something in here." Jessica's eyes swept the room. A few drawers were slightly misaligned, the way they often are when someone restores them hastily. A canvas was tucked, unusually, behind the radiator. "Margaret trusted you?" she asked gently. "She tried," Leo said after a pause. "But by the end, she was afraid. Not of Everett, I don't think. Of what she knew, and what it might do to the people left behind." Jessica's mind moved quietly. A studio of secrets, a man desperate for truth, and a painter who'd blurred the lines between confession and caution. It was mid-morning when Jessica noticed that Nina Morales was absent from the usual routine. Her chair at breakfast sat untouched, and the staff hadn't seen her since early evening the night before. Catherine, visibly strained, dismissed it with a taut smile. "She's prone to artistic retreats," she said lightly. "Sometimes she walks the cliffs to sketch. It's nothing unusual." But Jessica's instincts prickled. When young women disappeared from patterns, it rarely meant nothing. It was nearly 3 hours later that Reverend Green found Nina seated near the chapel's herb garden, her eyes hollow, her hands clutching a folded letter. Jessica approached carefully, and when Nina looked up, her expression was a strange mixture of shame and confusion. "I didn't mean to scare anyone," she whispered. "I just needed to read it somewhere quiet." Jessica crouched beside her, voice soft. "May I see it?" Nina hesitated, then handed it over. The paper was brittle, ink slightly smudged. A love letter. The writing formal, intimate, and unmistakably old. The salutation read, "My beloved silent muse." The signature at the bottom chilled Jessica, Everett. Nina shook her head. "It was folded into the back of one of Margaret's old sketchbooks. I wasn't looking for it." I swear Jessica read the letter again, each line dense with longing and regret. But it wasn't just romance. There was something unspoken in it. Guilt, perhaps, or history too dangerous to name outright. The past, Jessica thought, wasn't just creeping into the present. It had been sitting in plain sight, waiting to be found by the wrong, or the right, pair of eyes. That evening, Jessica laid the letter beside a pot of tea in the sitting room and reviewed it again. The phrasing, poetic but weighted, revealed far more than just an affair. "There was a time I believed we could keep our truths locked away. But now I see, what's buried does not die, it only waits." It was dated 30 years ago. Everett and Margaret had been more than professional acquaintances, and whatever had passed between them, it had ended abruptly. Jessica could only imagine what it had cost both of them to leave those words unsent, or perhaps unread. Catherine entered quietly, her eyes drawn instantly to the paper. That shouldn't have been found. Jessica offered no judgment. Was it meant to stay hidden? Catherine sat down, weary. "My aunt never spoke of him after I came to live here. I always thought it was bitterness, but now I think it was something deeper. Shame, perhaps. Or grief." Jessica nodded. "He returned because of this letter, or because of what it represented." Catherine's silence was answer enough. And if he found something in Margaret's work, in something personal, something dangerous, it might have threatened the peace you've built here. "Peace built on omissions," Catherine murmured, "and on the belief that art can say things words shouldn't." Jessica folded the letter carefully. Margaret's painting, the faceless woman, now felt fuller in meaning. A muse with no name, a smile that never faded because it had learned to endure. And still, questions lingered. If Everett had come seeking closure or confrontation, had someone else decided to silence him instead? Jessica stared into the fire, the shadows shifting like unspoken memories. The truth, she suspected, was not a single moment, but a long line of silences, stitched together by those too wounded to speak. The afternoon had brought with it a gentle mist that softened the edges of the garden beyond the parlour window. Jessica sat at Margaret's piano, not to play, but to think. Her fingers drifted lightly over the lacquered lid, pausing when she felt a faint give beneath the hinge. Curious, she lifted it. Inside, nestled among yellowing sheet music, was a folded length of cotton muslin, and tucked within it a black and white photograph. Jessica drew it out carefully. It showed two women standing beneath a sun-dappled arbor. One was unmistakably Margaret, younger but unmistakable. The other, slightly taller, wore a dress with a high collar and had a delicate scar along her right cheek. The back of the photograph bore a single line in ink: Lydia, last summer at the gatehouse. Jessica's heart slowed. Lydia Duval had been believed dead for decades, lost in the fire that had closed the original sanatorium. But the image was too recent for that. Judging by Margaret's age in the photograph, it had been taken perhaps 15, 20 years ago, long after Lydia was supposed to have perished. Why keep such a thing hidden? The questions clustered like ivy around a secret window. Had Lydia survived? Had Margaret helped her disappear? Or worse, helped conceal something about her fate? And what would Everett have done with that knowledge? Jessica tucked the photo into her notebook, the image of Lydia's faint smile lingering in her thoughts. Not peaceful, not quite forced, just quiet. As if she knew her place in the world had been rewritten, and she'd agreed to it out of love or fear. Some secrets, Jessica mused, weren't buried by accident. They were hidden with care and with guilt. The revelation of the photograph had shifted Jessica's understanding of the entire case. Everett hadn't simply returned to Taranport for artistic curiosity or a romantic nostalgia. He'd come to uncover something specific, something Margaret had painted around, written past, and carefully sealed in silence. And perhaps ultimately, something he wasn't meant to find. She returned to Reverend Green with the photo, and his expression paled the moment he saw it. "Dear Lord," he murmured, sitting heavily. "Lydia, I thought she'd—" "You knew her?" He nodded slowly. "Only once, long ago. She was kind, deeply sensitive, and terribly ill in the end. Margaret tried to protect her. When the fire happened, they let people believe Lydia had perished. But the truth—" Jessica leaned in gently. "She was institutionalized?" "Yes, in a private ward, after the sanatorium was shut down. Catherine was told Lydia had passed. But Margaret, she never let go." Jessica let the weight of his words settle. "So Everett found out?" "I suspect so," the Reverend said. "And I imagine he threatened to expose it. Not to be cruel, but because he believed secrets rot legacies. He believed in truth. Blunt truth." Jessica rose, her mind steady now. Everett hadn't been silenced because of who he was, but because of what he had unearthed. If Lydia had lived, and perhaps even died recently, it changed everything. It rewrote Margaret's story and Catherine's inheritance. It made Everett's inquiries not just inconvenient, but dangerous. And if Margaret's death had been natural, why the quiet lies? Why the fear in Catherine's voice? Why a teacup, a smile, and a missing name in the will? Jessica stood at the edge of the chapel aisle, watching the light filter through the stained glass. There were too many ghosts in this story, and someone, perhaps more than one, had gone to great lengths to keep them from speaking. Jessica walked slowly along the gallery wall where a series of Margaret's lesser-known paintings had been mounted, landscapes mostly, but there, near the end of the row, hung a portrait nearly everyone passed without a second glance. It was a garden scene, muted in tone. A woman in a lilac dress stood near a stone bench, her face turned away, gazing at something the viewer couldn't see. The figure's right hand rested lightly on a bell-shaped bloom, an iris, just beginning to wither. Jessica looked closer. The woman's hair was swept into a style different from Margaret's usual figures, tighter, more practical, and the shape of the shoulders, the curve of the jaw, even in profile, seemed familiar. She reached into her notebook and withdrew the photograph she'd found in the piano bench. Lydia. The scar was faint in the image, but present. It was the same woman. Margaret hadn't just painted anonymous muses, she'd painted Lydia, again and again, under different skies and costumes. Each brushstroke had been an echo of remembrance and guilt. Jessica felt the cold truth settle over her. Margaret had lived with the burden of her sister's disappearance. Whether she'd helped orchestrate it or had simply protected the silence after the fire, Jessica couldn't yet be sure. But Lydia had survived. That much was no longer speculation. And Everett. Perhaps he had uncovered this piecemeal. Enough to realize that the legacy Margaret had left behind wasn't the clean narrative everyone else had accepted. A legacy edited not by fiction, but omission. Jessica turned from the painting. She had seen Margaret's guilt not just in the content of her work, but in the very act of repetition. When a woman paints the same sorrow a dozen times under different skies, it isn't for beauty. It's for penance. Later that evening, Jessica sat once more in Margaret's studio, alone with the canvases that hadn't made it to the gallery walls. The room held a hush, as if even the dust remembered. She traced her fingers along the edge of a covered frame, pulling back the cloth with care. The portrait beneath was raw, unfinished in its details but heavy in feeling. Lydia again, unmistakable now, seated in a narrow chair with a closed window behind her. Her eyes stared forward this time, hollow and resigned. There was no background, no garden, no sky, just a room. Jessica studied it for several minutes. There was no signature, no date, but she sensed it had been painted late in Margaret's life. The brushwork was hesitant in places, then fierce, almost angry. Not at Lydia, but at something larger, perhaps at herself. She stepped back, the image lingering in her mind. Margaret had tried to tell the truth the only way she could. Not with confession, not with letters, but with pigment and silence. Everett must have recognized it for what it was. He'd been a critic too long not to know when art became something more dangerous than expression, when it crossed into revelation. Jessica folded her arms. Each portrait had been a cry without sound, and with each iteration, Margaret had both exposed and buried the truth further. Everett's crime had been in seeing too clearly, and perhaps in threatening to reveal what Margaret herself had spent a lifetime painting, but never naming. The next morning, Jessica quietly approached Catherine in the retreat's conservatory, where the younger woman sat surrounded by silence and clipped roses. Her face was drawn, her hands motionless in her lap. "I believe Everett discovered the truth about Lydia," Jessica said softly. "He may not have known everything, but he knew enough to press you, to make demands." Catherine looked up, startled. Then, slowly, she nodded. "He came to me 2 weeks before the dedication, said he had reason to believe Margaret had falsified documents, that Lydia didn't die in the fire. And he was right." Catherine closed her eyes. "I didn't know for certain, not until I found the photograph, and even then, Margaret never spoke of it, not openly. But he threatened to go public. Said the art world had a right to know." Jessica sat beside her. "Did he ask for money?" A pause. "Not exactly. He asked for, access. He wanted to curate a posthumous collection, to frame Margaret's final work as a confession." Jessica's brow tightened. "And you refused?" "Of course I did," Catherine snapped, then softened. "Margaret protected Lydia all her life. I wouldn't undo that with a single press release." Jessica was quiet for a moment. Catherine's motive wasn't monetary, it was emotional, legacy, loyalty, shame. Perhaps Everett hadn't asked for cash, just control. And for someone like Catherine, who had spent her life cleaning the edges of a family's past, that may have felt like blackmail all the same. Everett had reached too far into what had been intentionally buried. And Jessica was beginning to believe that someone, perhaps Catherine, perhaps not, had ensured he wouldn't reach again. The late afternoon sun filtered through the conservatory's tall windows, catching the rim of Jessica's teacup as she stirred her drink with quiet deliberation. Catherine sat opposite, a thin slice of lemon untouched on her saucer, hands folded in her lap. Jessica's tone was gentle but unyielding. You knew Everett was digging into the past, and he wasn't subtle. Catherine gave a small, composed nod. Everett was never subtle. But you didn't tell Margaret about his intentions. You waited, and then when he returned, you said nothing. I didn't want to upset her, Catherine said too quickly. Her smile was practiced, symmetrical, distant. She'd been fragile. Jessica tilted her head. Or did you worry she might have told him more than she told you? A flicker, barely a beat between words, but Jessica caught it, a momentary crack in the surface. I loved my aunt, Catherine said, but she wasn't always transparent. She painted her confessions, Jessica murmured. Catherine looked down at her cup, and Everett wanted to turn them into spectacle. Jessica's gaze sharpened. So you tried to protect her legacy, but did you try to protect her? That silence stretched. Jessica let the question hang, not because she expected an answer, but because she expected a reaction. And there it was, a tremble in the hand that lifted the teacup, a pause just long enough to betray calculation. Jessica stirred her tea once more. Catherine had lived for order, for controlled beauty, for restraint. But Margaret had unraveled artistically and emotionally. And Everett? He had stormed in with the power to expose what had been kept so carefully sealed. Beneath the civility of the tea setting, Jessica sensed something far more volatile. Fear dressed as dignity, and a loyalty twisted just enough to justify silence. That evening, Jessica sat alone in Margaret's old reading nook, a quiet corner with faded velvet cushions, and a narrow bookshelf still holding poetry, philosophy, and dog-eared sketchbooks. She opened one absent-mindedly, her fingers moving through the pages with practiced ease. Near the end, she paused. Tucked between two pages was a pressed leaf, brittle and brown, and beneath it a handwritten note in Margaret's careful script. Only one line had been written. I asked her not to interfere. She said I was confused. Jessica read it again, slower this time. The phrasing was subdued, almost embarrassed, not accusatory, not pleading, but tired and afraid. She let the book rest on her lap and turned inward. Until now, she had accepted Margaret's death as sad but unremarkable, a woman growing older, perhaps declining gently into solitude. But the pattern was forming too precisely. Everett's pressure, the missing journals, the unsigned painting, and now this note, all pointing not to peace, but suppression. What if Margaret hadn't simply slipped away? What if someone had made sure she wouldn't speak again? Jessica's thoughts returned to the teacup beside Everett's body, the cracked rim, the faint residue, and to the missing reading glasses. He hadn't been reading at all. Someone had placed the book in his lap, staged, just as Margaret's end may have been. She remembered what Catherine had said earlier that day. She was fragile. It had been offered as explanation, but perhaps it was justification. Jessica rose slowly, notebook in hand. If Margaret had been silenced, it hadn't been in cruelty. Not outright. It had been in the name of protection, the kind that smothers while claiming to soothe. The quietest deaths, Jessica thought, were often the loudest in what they left behind. And this one was whispering, louder by the day. The roses were in late bloom, their petals beginning to soften at the edges, just as secrets begin to lose their sharpness but never quite fade. Jessica had chosen the garden deliberately, a space cultivated for peace, where truth might bloom if given air and time. Catherine sat stiffly on a wrought-iron bench. Reverend Green lingered near the arbour, hands clasped behind his back. Leo stood apart, shifting his weight anxiously from one foot to the other. Nina clutched a sketchpad to her chest, her eyes downcast. Jessica spoke quietly, almost conversationally. There's something about Margaret's final painting that always troubled me. Not just the faceless figure, but the green stroke in the corner, an iris, I believe, a flower of remembrance or mourning. No one spoke. And then the will, Jessica continued, changed just weeks before her death with a single letter, J, followed by Everett's visit, his sudden death, and a cracked bell found in his coat pocket. An emblem of someone who once rang for help and received none. Jessica looked at each of them in turn. Margaret left a message. Not in ink, but in silence, and in symbols. But she was never alone in carrying it. Catherine opened her mouth, then closed it again. Her fingers clutched her shawl. Leo turned away, jaw tight. And Nina, young, loyal Nina, blinked hard, as if holding back a memory she wasn't sure she had permission to speak. Jessica waited, not pushing, just present. Secrets, she had learned, bloomed only in the right climate. And today the garden knew too much to remain silent any longer. The silence that followed was not heavy but suspended, a moment between inhale and exhale when the truth finally teetered on the edge. "I didn't kill him," Catherine said, her voice barely audible. "But I wanted him to leave." Jessica nodded gently. "Tell me." Catherine looked down at her clasped hands, knuckles pale. Everett came back a second time, unexpected. He said he had letters, paintings, proof that Lydia had lived, that Margaret had lied, and he threatened to use it. Her breath caught. I begged him to walk away, to let it be. But he mocked me, said I was just another woman afraid of the truth. "Were you?" Jessica asked kindly. Catherine hesitated. "I was afraid of what it would do, to Margaret's legacy, to the town, to all of us. So I put valerian in his tea, just enough to make him drowsy. I thought if he became sick, he'd leave. That's all I wanted." Jessica's mind turned over the detail. Valerian, harmless in small doses, but if combined with other substances or underlying conditions. "You believed it would scare him," Jessica said, "but not harm him." Catherine nodded. "I swear." Jessica studied her closely. Catherine's guilt felt real, but not complete. She had made Everett vulnerable, but had someone else pushed him past the point of return? And what of Margaret? If Catherine had crossed one line in fear, had she crossed another in grief? The answers hovered like the scent of rose hips, fragrant, fading, but still clinging to the air. Leo, who had stayed quiet through Catherine's confession, now stepped forward, jaw clenched. "I need to say something," he muttered. "She didn't know what I did." Jessica turned to him, silently inviting the truth. "I saw Everett with the painting the night before he died," Leo said. He was laughing, talking to himself, saying Margaret was a coward, that he'd force the truth into the light if no one else would. He shifted uncomfortably. "I was angry. I'd promised Margaret I'd protect her, so I added something to his tea." Jessica's eyes narrowed slightly. "What was it?" "Just a few drops of tincture," Leo said. "Nothing deadly. Skullcap and chamomile. I thought it'd make him sleep, maybe mess with his head enough to scare him off." "Did you know Catherine had already dosed his tea?" He looked stunned. Number that I didn't even know she'd seen him that evening. Jessica absorbed it. Two people, separately and unknowingly, had tampered with the same cup, each intending to frighten, not to kill. But the combination, unmeasured and unmonitored, had turned a warning into a grave. "Why didn't you come forward?" "I panicked," Leo said. "Then when he died, and no one asked questions, I told myself maybe it was fate." Jessica's gaze was steady. Number, it was fear. And now, what had been layered with good intentions had become something far darker. A death by misjudgment, cloaked in civility. The truth was no longer about guilt. It was about consequence. Jessica remained still for a long moment, the wind stirring the garden around her, as if nature, too, awaited what came next. Margaret, she said softly, deserves the same clarity. Catherine turned toward her, the colour draining from her cheeks. I never meant to hurt her, she whispered. She was unravelling, talking to herself, painting through the night, saying she had to bring Lydia back into the light. I was afraid she'd expose it all. Jessica said nothing. She started asking questions about the sanatorium records, Catherine went on, her voice brittle. Said she wanted to hold a public showing, to dedicate her final painting as a memorial to Lydia. Her fingers trembled. That couldn't happen, not after all she'd done to protect her, to protect us. Jessica's voice was quiet. What did you do? Catherine exhaled a slow, shuddering breath. I put something in her tea, just a mild sedative, valerian again, nothing more. I thought she'd rest, that she'd cool down, sleep, come to her senses. But she didn't wake up. No, Catherine said. She never woke up. Jessica's heart ached, not with anger, but with the sorrow of understanding. Why didn't you call for help? I told the doctor it was heart failure. No one questioned it. She was older, tired. Everyone wanted to believe it. And perhaps, Jessica thought, that was the most tragic truth of all. Not that Margaret had been silenced with cruelty, but that her death had been accepted with relief. A gentle erasure. Catherine's face crumpled, her mask finally slipping. She just wanted the truth to be known, she whispered. And you wanted the lie to stay beautiful, Jessica replied softly. The cracked ceramic bell rested now on the garden table, its glaze dulled with time. Jessica turned it in her palm, the faint sun and gate emblem catching the afternoon light. It had belonged once to a forgotten patient of the old sanatorium, a woman who rang for help each morning and was never answered. Later, it became Lydia's, and in time, Margaret's. Now it was a symbol of all three, of women who had been silenced not by force, but by the weight of other people's decisions. Reverend Green sat beside her in quiet reflection. What will you do, Jessica? Tell the truth, she said simply. And the law? Jessica looked toward the rose hedge, blooming in shadow. The law doesn't always account for the cost of silence, but perhaps a proper remembrance can. The bell rang softly in her hand as a breeze passed through. Not loud, not demanding, just present. Catherine had committed no murder in intent. Leo had meant no harm, but the damage, unintended though it was, had rippled through every life around Margaret's, echoing like the sound of a bell in an empty corridor. Jessica placed it beside the portrait now displayed at the edge of the garden, the faceless woman finally named. Lydia, and through her, Margaret too. Their silence had not saved them, but perhaps in the end it had spoken. The morning after the garden gathering dawned pale and still. Jessica watched from the window as Leo stood by the gate of Briar House, arms crossed, waiting not for permission, but for consequence. When the sheriff's car arrived, there was no struggle, no raised voice, just a quiet conversation by the stone path. Jessica stepped out in time to catch the end of it. I didn't mean for any of it to happen, Leo said, but I can't live with pretending I didn't help it along. Jessica nodded solemnly. Intentions matter, Leo, but so do actions. He looked down, voice raw. I thought I was protecting Margaret. In trying to guard her past, Jessica said gently, you overlooked what she was fighting to reveal. Leo handed the officer a small cloth pouch, the same one that had held the tincture he'd used in Everett's tea. This belongs with the record. There was no dramatic arrest, only a mutual understanding. Leo had already sentenced himself long before anyone else could. As the car pulled away, Jessica felt no triumph, only a quiet sadness that the truth had come at such a cost. But it had come. And now, perhaps, healing could follow. Later that afternoon, Jessica found Catherine in the old greenhouse, her shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders as she watered the irises. A ritual gesture, silent and methodical. "I'm resigning from the retreat," she said, before Jessica even spoke. Jessica didn't answer at first. She watched the water trail down the ceramic pot, soaking the soil beneath the sleeping roots. "I think," Catherine said, "I confused silence with protection. But they're not the same, are they?" "No," Jessica replied softly. "Silence sometimes preserves dignity, but sometimes it only deepens shame." Catherine gave a weary smile. "This place needs someone new, someone who can let the truth live in the open." She reached into her pocket and pressed a key into Jessica's hand. "It's for the upstairs chest in Margaret's studio. I think she wanted you to find it." Jessica nodded, her fingers closing around the brass. Catherine stepped away from the flowers, her posture straighter than it had been in days. "I loved her, you know." "I believe you did." "And I think I finally understand how she loved Lydia." Jessica said nothing. She let Catherine walk back toward the house, each step a quiet resignation, but perhaps also a beginning. 2 days later, the studio door creaked open to visitors for the first time since Margaret's passing. Reverend Green had arranged the event with gentle precision. Not a formal unveiling, but a tribute of quiet reverence. Jessica moved through the space slowly, watching as townspeople tiptoed between the canvases. There were no labels, no dramatic lights, only sunlight through tall windows and the scent of aged varnish. At the center stood the painting that had started it all, the faceless woman in lavender, now flanked by 2 smaller portraits, one of Margaret, one of Lydia. Jessica noticed a new inscription beneath the central frame, for the sisters who remembered what the world forgot. Margaret's voice, it seemed, had found its resonance at last. Reverend Green joined her at the far corner of the room. She never spoke of these works in public, but she told me once, some truths must be painted, not spoken, because paint, unlike words, doesn't flinch. Jessica smiled faintly. "Or forgive?" "No," he said, "but it remembers." Visitors lingered near a side table where the cracked ceramic bell had been placed beneath glass, a symbol no longer of despair, but of endurance. Jessica stepped back, letting the hush of the space wrap around her. This wasn't closure. It was continuity, and it was enough. Jessica remained behind after the visitors had gone, alone in the studio where memory had been turned into brushstroke. She sat quietly across from Lydia's final portrait, the one Margaret had never dared display while alive. This time, Lydia faced the viewer fully. No profile, no blur. Her eyes, dark and uncertain, met Jessica's with quiet defiance. The scar on her cheek remained, but it no longer dominated her face. Margaret had painted her sister not as a ghost, but as a person. Hurt, yes, but whole. Jessica studied the brushwork, the color choices, the symbolism. A cracked teacup rested on a windowsill behind Lydia, almost unnoticed, and beside it an iris just past bloom. How long had Margaret carried this truth within her? The key Catherine had given her had unlocked a chest of Margaret's journals. In one, Jessica had found a sketch, rough, tentative, of Lydia in youth. Beneath it, Margaret had written, "You were the truth I couldn't speak, so I painted you into silence." Jessica traced her finger along the edge of the frame. Margaret had never confessed in words, but she had known, she had mourned, and she had loved her sister with a fierceness that defied shame. Now, Lydia hung where she should have always been, not as myth or memory, but as herself. Jessica stood, notebook in hand. Some stories were never meant to be spoken aloud, but they still needed to be told. And in the quiet gaze of the painted woman, Jessica felt both question and answer. The morning was crisp when Jessica returned to her desk, a steaming cup of tea by her elbow and her notebook open to a blank page. Outside, the The first hints of autumn clung to the trees, and the mist off the coast curled like memory against the panes. She began to write. There is a kind of silence that isn't peace, a stillness born not of calm, but of pressure. We call it discretion, or tradition, or even love. But too often it is fear in disguise. Jessica paused. In Taranport, Margaret Duval had painted a truth she couldn't say aloud. A truth about a sister who never burned in a fire, but who was burned out of the record. About an art critic who reached too far. About a niece who confused love with preservation. And about a gardener who mistook loyalty for justice. The cost of that silence had been one woman's legacy and one man's life. We like to think the past stays where we left it, she wrote, but it waits. Sometimes in corners, sometimes in portraits, always in the quiet. Jessica leaned back, her thoughts curling around the bell, the painting, the unfinished journals. What struck her most was not the guilt, but the gentleness of those who had tried to carry it. Margaret had never meant harm. Catherine had tried to protect what was already lost. Leo had loved blindly. And even Everett, for all his arrogance, had chased truth, not malice. She set down her pen. In the end, no one had been evil, only human. And sometimes, Jessica thought, that's the most dangerous thing of all. She looked out at the garden below. A single iris had bloomed late in the season. She smiled. Sometimes the most powerful truths are not the loud ones, but the ones whispered over time, through ink, through paint, through memory, and they endure. Sometimes the past doesn't whisper. It lingers in the brush strokes, the unsent letters, and the rooms we leave locked for too long. But I wonder, did Leo truly act alone, or was he simply the last piece in a puzzle crafted years before he ever arrived? Tell me what you think. Was justice served, or did something remain hidden in the silence? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story stirred something in you, do give it a like, pass it along to a fellow mystery lover, and subscribe for more tales where the truth waits, quietly to be found.